I want to note just a couple of things that were highlighted this morning, and I think you can think about questions as the panelists talk. So I mentioned earlier, what are the key leverage points for our investment? There were numerous statements made this morning: education and workforce training, infrastructure investment, marketing and market development. Everybody talks about quality of life. How do you measure that? How do you invest specifically to improve the quality of life, which many of our entrepreneurs are here in Vermont just because of that quality of life? And lastly, innovation. One of the things that this board, when looking at all of the applications, considers is innovation. Are you going to create something new? Are you going to change something that exists that leads to more jobs or more land usage or greater sales? So with that, I'm going to turn to Ella. Ella is going to talk about the 3 investment areas. And I think that's probably starting on your 3rd page of your handout. She's going to describe the process that the board went through trying to figure out where to invest the first $1 million in grant money. We are now in round 2. We have approximately $1.2 million in round 2 to distribute across the working landscape as well as to service providers. And then she's also going to talk about the interplay between the 3 investment areas and impact. Ellen.
So I'll start just with a couple of comments on the process. This, as you know, you've either heard or you are hearing now, it's been a pretty overwhelming project for a board and a small staff to undertake to quickly invest $1 million+ in Vermont working landscapes businesses. So it's been an intense ride. And early on in that intensity was trying to distill out of the legislative materials that we've got and the statutory language about what the board was supposed to be investing in, trying to distill that into some manageable buckets, as we call them, or areas that we could solicit applications around that could be comparable and could be somewhat looking at apples to apples and trying to make decisions about. And so the way that landed, I'm just going to sort of talk a little bit through the reasoning and also say that this is not set in stone for the Working Lands Enterprise Initiative. For the 2nd year in a row, we're following very similar groupings of types of projects that we're investing in, but we all know that it needs to be open to change, and we have discussions at the board level about potentially how we might tweak these groupings going forward. So, as you've heard or can see in your handout, there's 3 investment areas that both last year and this year are what's getting put out there for to solicit applications and proposals. The first being enterprise investments, the second being service provider grants, and the third being capital infrastructure investments. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time differentiating those 3. I think the second one is somewhat clear how it's differentiated, but all of us have sort of struggled to really differentiate that first area and the third. The enterprise investments piece was really designed to make somewhat small, like $3,000 to $15,000 to $20,000 grants, depending on your perspective whether that's a large grant or a small grant. But in relationship to the other 2 areas, there are smaller grants for the Working Lands Enterprise Board into individual enterprises. Which are, and this is going to be the same for both the first area and the third area, which are farm, food, forestry, or forest products enterprises. And we are looking for working lands benefits, so those that are tied to products coming off the Vermont working landscape. Smallish grants that require a smaller match than the other buckets. So if somebody's asking for $10,000, in this first bucket we're requiring a 25% match. So a $10,000 grant, meaning $2,500, so a total of a minimum of a $12,500 project. So way less than a 1-to-1 match, which some programs require. Allowing an enterprise that might have a project that they really would love to do someday, but do not have the cash on hand, or they are going to go out and get a loan for a project, but really need some equity to make that loan possible. possible, and just really don't have the cash flow or the savings to invest in that project right now, or might never have the initiative to take that project on. So in general, these kinds of grants we see, and I have some experience with similar kinds of grants in the past through the, that we've been doing through the Farm Viability Program over the years. We expect to see enterprises do projects quicker than they would do them if they weren't getting a grant, more robustly and in a more sustainable way than they would do them if they're sort of piecemealing as they had cash to put together something, and also sometimes buy a better sized piece of equipment, for example, that's really going to still be with them in 3 to 5 years, rather than sort of invest in the smallest next stage equipment and then in 6 months to 12 months be needing to replace that piece of equipment again. So those are the kinds of things that we in the past have seen with these kinds of grants, and that the board expects to see. Those enterprise investments can be used for planning projects, for capital, for equipment, for construction. So really, really broad what those grants can go towards. And we certainly saw a lot of grants that we gave out for equipment and construction, and also things like market research and marketing planning. For example, Vermont, Siobhan received an award to do some market research. The Guild of Vermont Furniture Makers also around market research. And then a number that were for production related equipment, such as Joe's Soup trying to scale up their soup making business, Vermont Switchel for some production line equipment, Kruger Norton Sugar House for some sugaring equipment, things like that, and the logging business that received some funding for logging equipment. So the impacts that we're looking for are actually fairly similar all the way along the line, but I'm going to differentiate that in this area we're looking for impacts that are going to benefit primarily that enterprise. If it benefits other enterprises too, great, but that's not a requirement we'll see later on in the third investment area. So we're really looking for impacts that are economic development impacts, improving financial viability of a business and the sustainability of the business overall. Projects that are going to create jobs. None of these are a requirement in and of themselves. We will fund a project that isn't necessarily going to create jobs, even in some cases something that's going to improve the efficiency of a production and thus maybe even reduce the need to add jobs in a business. So as long as we're looking at bolstering enterprises in one way or another through viability, product quality, new product development, accessing new markets, innovating and demonstrating new models, and improving efficiency, which, like I say, can sometimes go against creation of jobs. So those are the kinds of impacts we're expecting and requiring them proposals to demonstrate, and things that we were looking at in terms of making award choices. Service provider grants, fairly straightforward, looking to invest in those providing services and support and technical assistance to these same kinds of farm, food, forest, and forest products businesses. Really, these grants are a really wide range, from $10,000 to $150,000 is the range that people could request this year from the Working on Enterprise Board. So something like a producer association would be looking for more like $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 to do a market development project or some training. Some larger programs might be looking for $50,000, $100,000, $150,000 to make some big investments in something like an incubator space. So a real range of projects in the service provider grant area. Certainly the eligible entities are really across the board. I think primarily we saw nonprofits get awards, nonprofits that are doing technical assistance already, but any entity, whether it's a private entity providing services or public or nonprofit entity, we're all eligible. And in this area, 50% match, so expecting organizations to be fundraising to match these at least 50%. And providing all kinds of TA, from production to financial feasibility, needs assessments, business planning, regulatory assistance, accessing financing, and workforce development. We certainly saw a number of workforce development projects that were funded. Vermont Skilled Butchers and Meat Cutting Program received a grant. Vermont Wood Manufacturing Association also for some workforce development work. And then quite a number that were providing technical assistance to existing businesses as well. So I'd say those two categories. And then the impacts that we're looking for are those same kinds of impacts that I described before, but for the clients that are coming through that program, or the businesses that are being incubated through that program. And then the capital infrastructure investments really is set apart from the enterprise investments in that it's more focused on infrastructure expenses like equipment and construction, in some cases with funds and planning work for larger investment projects as well. But the piece that sets it apart is that investment into one business is going to have a wide-ranging impact with many other businesses in the supply chain or the value chain. So, this year the range is from $15,000 to $75,000 that people can apply to. Last year it was up to $100,000. It's required to have a 1-to-1 cash match or 100% cash match. And can also be used for working capital for some of these larger businesses as well. Some of the examples that we funded this past year were the Vermont Woodworking School for the incubator space, a cheese microbiology lab at the Jasper Hill farm, and then increasing freezer capacity at the Vermont Woodworking Storage, which is a place that a lot of producers use to store and market crops. So those are some of the examples and the kinds of things that we're looking for as a board. I think a real important interplay for the board is that, and that the board is learning about and is considering how we're going to address this in the future is how folks come in and whether they've already been through a technical assistance program and now are ready for investment to really carry a project through implementation, or whether they're coming and probably could use some technical assistance as they're implementing a project, or whether they're really ahead of themselves. And sometimes the board may say, you know, we don't feel you're ready for this investment, even though we like it in concept, and might be either suggesting some technical assistance program, and then the board's ability to fund those kinds of technical assistance programs through the service provider grant pool, and how the board either sort of really guides certain kinds of technical assistance programs they want us to see, or whether at this point just responding to proposals that come into the service provider grant pool. So I think there's going to be ongoing discussions with the board about how that works. I know the board really could see the difference between projects that had done a foundational planning piece and those that were less, had really analyzed their idea in a different way and hadn't really come to a place where they understood the ramifications and the cash flow of a project, or really had done enough market research to really understand how much they really could sell of a certain new product and where they would market it. So you can see that in the applications that came to the board, and that's certainly something that the board is learning from. I think that there's a couple of businesses we're starting to see don't fit really well into the three-pool area. I think we feel like it's fairly well, we've really fairly covered the basis of the kinds of businesses that we'd like to be funding, but one area are larger commodity businesses, particularly dairy and maple, that they certainly fit into the enterprise investment, but a $30,000 to $20,000 investment might be smaller than what they really need to really grow their business or really innovate in certain ways. And yet, if they're a commodity entity, they're not a grant to that one business isn't necessarily going to affect the supply chain in the same way unless it's a really innovative model that we replicated. So I think the board is seeing these challenges. Not that we didn't fund any conventional dairy farms, but I think that there's just some we're analyzing that as we move forward, and I think that there's room for some change.
One of the assets of this board is that it is a mix of service providers from the public and nonprofit sector and entrepreneurs like Eleanor and like Mike Rainville. Ella has run the Farm Viability Program for many years, and now the HCV has expanded it to Forest Products Viability, understanding that the need for that level of technical assistance to the forestry and forest products businesses is critical. I want to also say that I think part of what we heard this morning is that marriage under the auspices of the working landscape between farm and food systems and forestry and forest products is invaluable. We have lessons learned from all sectors. And this board continues to listen, as Ella just said. we didn't have the answers when we went into this. The applications in round one, 397 applications, of which we funded 36. $12 million in demand for $1 million in funding. We continue to say, where is the greatest need? How do we leverage these funds with other funds to make the greatest impact? And I think Ella's just done a great job defining perspectives, certainly not exhaustive, that the board has approached this process with.